Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, where the mountains press close and the sun rarely touches the valley floor, there lived a family whose very name was whispered like a curse. The Mordecai clan had settled in Devil's Backbone Hollow in 1847, arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a wagon filled with peculiar wooden crates that they guarded more carefully than their own children. What the neighboring families didn't know was that the Mordecais hadn't come to Kentucky seeking prosperity or freedom. They had come running from something far worse than poverty, carrying with them traditions so ancient and terrible that even the witch trials of Salem would have paled in comparison. The first sign that something was wrong came during the winter of 1848, when livestock throughout the valley began dying in ways that defied explanation. Cattle were found drained of blood, but with no wounds, their eyes turned completely white. Horses would be discovered standing upright in their stalls, alive but catatonic, their manes and tails braided in intricate patterns that no human hand could have created overnight. The local veterinarian, Dr. Samuel Hutchinson, documented these incidents in his journal, writing that the animals appeared to have been touched by something that understood their essence better than they understood themselves. But it was the children who first recognized what the Mordecais truly were. Young Sarah Whitman, only 7 years old, came home from playing near Devil's Backbone Creek with stories of seeing the Mordecai children standing in perfect circles around dead trees, humming in voices that seemed to come from deep underground. When her mother dismissed these tales as imagination, Sarah drew pictures of what she had seen, crude sketches that showed human figures with elongated limbs and faces that were somehow both childlike and ancient. The Mordecai family appeared normal enough during daylight hours. Ezekiel Mordecai, the patriarch, was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair who claimed to be a traveling preacher. His wife, Delilah, rarely spoke to outsiders, but was known for her herb garden that flourished even in the poorest soil. Their 5 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, helped with the farming and seemed well behaved, though neighbors noted they never played with other children, and their eyes held a strange intensity that made adults uncomfortable. What no one realized was that the Mordecais practiced what they called the Old Communion, a ritual that predated Christianity by millennia. Every new moon, when the hollow was at its darkest, the family would gather in a clearing behind their cabin, where 13 ancient oak trees formed a natural circle. These trees, according to Cherokee legends that the white settlers had dismissed as superstition, were known as the Council of Shadows, marking a place where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead grew thin. The ritual itself was complex and horrifying in its precision. Each family member would take their place beneath one of the oak trees, leaving one tree for what they called the witness, an entity they believed observed and judged their offerings. Ezekiel would begin by reading from a book bound in what appeared to be human skin, its pages covered with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. The words were not in any earthly language, yet somehow the children had learned to speak them fluently, their young voices joining in harmonies that made the very air seem to thicken. The offerings began simply enough. Small animals, usually rabbits or squirrels, would be brought to the center of the circle, but the Mordecais didn't simply kill these creatures. Instead, they performed what they called the rendering, a process where they would use carved bone knives to make precise incisions that allowed the animal's life force to drain slowly into specially prepared vessels. These vessels, made from hollowed gourds and decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, would then be buried at the base of each oak tree. As the years passed, the rituals grew more elaborate and demanding. The entity they called the witness seemed to require increasingly complex offerings. By 1852, the family had begun incorporating human elements into their ceremonies. At first, it was just hair and nail clippings, stolen from neighbors' homes during the day when families were working in distant fields. Delilah had a particular talent for this, moving through houses like a shadow and collecting these personal items that she would weave into elaborate patterns during the dark moon ceremonies. But the true horror of the Mordecai practices didn't become apparent until the summer of 1854, when traveling merchant Jonas Crawford made the mistake of asking too many questions about the family's nocturnal activities. Crawford had been selling supplies throughout the region for over a decade and prided himself on understanding the mountain folk. But something about the Mordecais unsettled him. When he mentioned to other families that he'd seen strange lights in Devil's Backbone Hollow during the new moon, several people warned him to mind his own business. Crawford should have listened. Instead, driven by curiosity and perhaps a touch of greed, thinking the lights might indicate hidden treasure, he decided to investigate on his own. On the night of August's new moon, he concealed himself among the underbrush near the Oak Circle, planning to solve the mystery once and for all. What he witnessed that night was recorded in a journal found years later among his possessions, pages that were stained with what appeared to be tears and blood. According to Crawford's account, the Mordecai family had captured a young Cherokee woman who had been traveling alone through the mountains. She was bound to the 13th oak tree, the one reserved for the witness, and what followed was a ceremony that Crawford described as an affront to God and nature alike. The family didn't simply kill the woman. Instead, they performed the rendering on a human subject, using their bone knives to make incisions that followed the pattern of what Crawford called invisible rivers beneath her skin. As her life force drained into their vessels, the oak trees themselves began to change. Their bark grew darker, their branches seemed to reach toward the woman with deliberate intent, and from their roots emerged a substance that Crawford described as black milk that moved against gravity. But the most terrifying moment came when the woman's life finally ended. According to Crawford's journal, she didn't simply die. Instead, her voice continued speaking, but the words came from the trees themselves, as if her essence had been absorbed into the wood. The trees began to whisper in the Cherokee woman's voice, sharing secrets about the people of the valley, revealing hidden shames and buried sins with a knowledge that no living person could possess. Crawford fled that night, but not before the Mordecais discovered his presence. Ezekiel Mordecai looked directly at his hiding spot and smiled, a expression that Crawford said held more malice than a dozen devils. The family made no immediate move to pursue him, seemingly content to let him carry the memory of what he had witnessed. Crawford never made it out of Pike County. His body was found 3 days later by a search party, discovered sitting upright against a tree at the mouth of Devil's Backbone Hollow. There were no wounds on his corpse, no signs of violence, but his hair had turned completely white and his eyes had been removed with surgical precision. More disturbing was his posture, positioned exactly as if he were still watching something in the distance, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The local sheriff, a practical man named William Dobson, tried to investigate Crawford's death, but found himself strangely reluctant to venture too deep into Devil's Backbone Hollow. Every time he approached the Mordecai property, he reported feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched, of invisible eyes tracking his every movement. His deputy, Thomas Mills, developed severe nosebleeds whenever they got within a mile of the family's cabin, and both men began experiencing shared nightmares of oak trees that walked on root legs through the mountains. The investigation was quietly abandoned when Sheriff Dobson's own daughter began sleepwalking, found several mornings standing in the family's yard facing the direction of Devil's Backbone Hollow. During these episodes, she would speak in the Cherokee woman's voice, describing the layout of the Mordecai property in detail despite never having been there, and sharing information about the family's activities that a child couldn't possibly know. By 1856, the Mordecai clan's influence had spread throughout the valley like a slowly spreading poison. Families found themselves compelled to leave small offerings at the edge of their properties, bundles of food or handmade items that would disappear overnight. Those who refused to participate suffered a series of inexplicable misfortunes. Crops would fail despite perfect growing conditions. Wells would run dry in areas where water had never been scarce, and children would develop strange illnesses that left them pale and listless. The family's power seemed to center around their collection of human essence, gathered through decades of their twisted ceremonies. They had created what they called the Grove of Whispers, where 13 oak trees now served as repositories for the life force and memories of their victims. These trees had grown into grotesque shapes, their branches intertwining in patterns that suggested grasping hands and screaming faces. Local Cherokee elders, the few who hadn't been driven from the region, spoke of the trees as hungry wood that fed on human suffering. The end came suddenly in the winter of 1858, though not through any human intervention. A group of federal surveyors mapping the region for a proposed railroad discovered Devil's Backbone Hollow and immediately reported their findings to authorities in Louisville. The survey team's official report, sealed for 70 years, described a scene of such supernatural horror that it challenged their understanding of reality itself. The Mordecai cabin was found empty but perfectly preserved, as if the family had simply vanished mid-activity. Meals sat half-eaten on the table, with food that showed no signs of decay despite clearly having been abandoned for weeks. More disturbing was the family's collection, carefully cataloged and stored in the wooden crates they had brought from the east. Hundreds of glass vessels filled with what appeared to be human blood, each labeled with names and dates spanning over a decade. Boxes of hair organized by color and texture. Jars containing what the surveyors could only describe as pieces of human shadow, dark substances that moved independently of any light source. But the most horrifying discovery was the journal kept by Ezekiel Mordecai, written in a mixture of English and the strange symbols that appeared throughout their property. The journal revealed that the family hadn't simply been practicing isolated rituals, but had been preparing for something they called the Great Joining. According to Mordecai's writings, their decades of human sacrifice had been feeding an entity that existed in the spaces between the living and dead worlds, something that would eventually grow strong enough to cross over permanently. The final entry in the journal dated just days before the surveyor's arrival, suggested that the Mordecais had achieved their goal. They had offered themselves as the final sacrifice, willingly allowing the entity they had served to consume their physical forms so that it could manifest in the material world. The survey team found evidence of this transformation in the oak grove, where the 13 trees had grown together into a single massive organism that pulsed with what appeared to be its own heartbeat. The federal government's response was swift and decisive. The entire hollow was sealed off and declared a restricted area, officially due to dangerous geological instability. The railroad route was quietly rerouted, and all records of the Mordecai family were removed from county archives. The surviving members of the survey team were reassigned to distant territories and sworn to secrecy under threat of treason charges. But sealing off Devil's Backbone Hollow didn't end the Mordecai legacy. Locals in Pike County still report strange phenomena in the area. Hikers who venture too close to the restricted zone describe hearing voices calling their names from deep within the forest, speaking in languages they don't recognize but somehow understand. The voices promise answers to life's greatest mysteries, offer solutions to problems that seem insurmountable, but those who follow these calls are never seen again. More disturbing are the reports of children throughout Pike County who claim to receive visits from other children who look exactly like them, but speak with adult voices and knowledge of events that happened before they were born. These doppelganger children always extend invitations to come play in the grove where the trees remember everything, and families who experience these visitations invariably find themselves drawn to move away from the region within weeks. The Mordecai clan represents something that challenges our understanding of human evil, a family that didn't simply practice dark rituals, but served as conduits for forces that exist beyond our comprehension. Their legacy reminds us that in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains keep their oldest secrets, some traditions are too terrible to die, and some hungers are too ancient to ever be satisfied. The trees in Devil's Backbone Hollow still stand, still whisper, still remember everything the Mordecai family fed them, and according to those brave enough to listen, they're still waiting for someone desperate enough to hear their promises of power and willing to pay the price for joining their eternal congregation. Deep in the fog-shrouded mountains of eastern Kentucky, where cell towers can't reach and GPS signals die like whispers in the wind, there exists a hollow that doesn't appear on any modern map. The locals call it Bone Creek Valley, though few will say the name aloud after sunset. Those who remember the old stories speak of a family that settled there in 1834, arriving during the worst winter in recorded memory, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a wagon load of peculiar wooden boxes that they guarded more fiercely than their own children. The Ashford clan didn't come to Kentucky seeking prosperity or freedom like so many other families of that era. They came running from something far worse than poverty, carrying with them traditions so ancient and terrible that even the witch trials of Salem would have seemed merciful by comparison. What the neighboring families didn't understand was that the Ashfords hadn't simply fled their past, they had brought it with them, along with practices that would transform their isolated valley into something that challenged the very understanding of human nature. The first signs that something was fundamentally wrong appeared within months of the family's arrival. Samuel Ashford, the patriarch, was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely silver hair and eyes so pale they seemed almost colorless in certain light. His wife, Mercy, rarely spoke to outsiders, but was known for her unsettling habit of staring at pregnant women with an intensity that made them physically uncomfortable. Their 7 children, ranging in age from 5 to 17, helped with the farming and appeared well behaved to casual observers, though neighboring families noted they never played with other children and seemed to communicate with each other through glances and subtle gestures that felt almost ritualistic. What no one realized was that the Ashfords practiced something they called the deepening, a ritual tradition that predated Christianity by centuries and drew its power from the deliberate cultivation of human suffering. Every new moon, when Bone Creek Valley lay shrouded in absolute darkness, the family would gather in a natural amphitheater hidden behind their property, where ancient limestone formations created a perfect circle. These stones, according to Cherokee legends that the white settlers had dismissed as primitive superstition, marked a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the hungry dead grew dangerously thin. The ritual itself was complex and horrifying in its methodical precision. Each family member would take their designated position around the circle, with Samuel standing at the center beside what appeared to be a natural well that descended deep into the limestone bedrock. The opening was roughly 6 feet in diameter, perfectly round as if carved by deliberate hands, though geological surveys would later suggest it was a natural sinkhole. Samuel would begin by reading from a book bound in what local folklore claimed was human skin, its pages covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light of the bone candles that provided the only illumination. The offerings began with animals, usually livestock stolen from neighboring farms during the dark nights when families slept deeply and trusted in their isolation for protection. But the Ashfords didn't simply kill these creatures in some crude sacrifice. Instead, they performed what they called the rendering, a process where they would use specially forged iron tools to make precise incisions that allowed the animal's life essence to drain slowly into specially prepared vessels made from hollowed human skulls. These vessels, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly and caused temporary blindness in those who stared too long, would then be poured into the well while the family chanted in a language that predated any known human tongue. As the years passed and the rituals grew more elaborate, the entity they served began to demand increasingly complex offerings. By 1840, the family had begun incorporating human elements into their ceremonies. At first, it was just hair and nail clippings, collected from the homes of their neighbors during social visits or stolen from graves in the small cemetery that served the scattered mountain community. Mercy had developed a particular talent for this collection, moving through houses like a shadow while families attended church services or worked in distant fields, gathering these personal remnants that she would later weave into elaborate patterns during the dark moon ceremonies. But the true horror of the Ashford practices didn't become apparent until the autumn of 1843, when a traveling preacher named Reverend Jonathan Wells made the mistake of staying too long in their valley and asking too many questions about the family's nocturnal activities. Wells had been ministering to isolated mountain communities for over 2 decades and prided himself on understanding the peculiar ways of the hill folk, but something about the Ashfords disturbed him in ways he couldn't articulate. When he mentioned to other families that he'd heard strange singing coming from the direction of Bone Creek during his evening prayers, several people warned him to mind his own business and move on to the next settlement. Wells should have heeded their advice. Instead, driven by what he later described in his journal as a divine compulsion to confront evil wherever it lurked, he decided to investigate the family's midnight activities. On the night of October's new moon, he concealed himself among the brush near the limestone circle, planning to gather evidence of whatever ungodly practices were taking place in the darkness. What he witnessed that night was recorded in a journal found years later among his possessions, pages that were stained with what appeared to be tears, blood, and something else that defied identification. According to Wells's account, the Ashford family had captured two young Cherokee women who had been traveling through the mountains on their way to rejoin family members in the West. The women were bound to stakes driven into the ground at specific points around the circle, positioned according to some geometric pattern that Wells said made his eyes water when he tried to follow its logic. What followed was a ceremony that Wells described as an abomination that would make Satan himself weep with envy. The family didn't simply murder the women. Instead, they performed the rendering on human subjects, using their iron tools to make incisions that followed what Wells called the hidden rivers of life beneath the skin. As the women's life force drained into the skull vessels, the limestone formations themselves began to change. The stone grew darker, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, and from the depths of the well came sounds that Wells described as the voices of every soul that had ever been lost, crying out in harmonies that spoke of hungers older than creation itself. But the most terrifying moment came when the women's lives finally ended. According to Wells's journal, they didn't simply die. Instead, their voices continued speaking, but the words came from the stones themselves, as if their essence had been absorbed into the very rock. The limestone circle began to whisper in the Cherokee women's voices, sharing secrets about the people of the valley, revealing hidden shames and buried sins with knowledge that no living person could possess. The stones spoke of children who would be born deformed, of crops that would fail, of madness that would claim entire bloodlines, all in voices that carried the musical cadence of the murdered women. Wells fled that night, but not before Samuel Ashford looked directly at his hiding spot and smiled with an expression that the preacher said held more malice than 1,000 demons and more knowledge than any human soul should possess. The family made no immediate move to pursue him, seemingly content to let him carry the memory of what he had witnessed back into the world beyond their valley. Wells never made it to the next settlement. His body was discovered 5 days later by a search party, found sitting upright against a tree at the mouth of Bone Creek Valley, exactly as if he were still watching something in the distance. There were no wounds on his corpse, no signs of violence or struggle, but his hair had turned completely white, and his fingernails had grown to an impossible length, as if weeks had passed in the few days since his disappearance. Most disturbing was the expression frozen on his face, not one of terror, but of understanding, as if in his final moments he had comprehended something so profound and terrible that it had stopped his heart. The local sheriff, a practical man named Marcus Stone, who had dealt with mountain feuds and isolated violence for 15 years, tried to investigate Wells's death, but found himself strangely reluctant to venture too deep into Bone Creek Valley. Every time he approached the Ashford property, he reported feeling an overwhelming sense of being observed by invisible eyes that seemed to count his heartbeats and measure the warmth of his blood. His deputy, Thomas Crawford, developed severe migraines whenever they got within 2 miles of the family's cabin, migraines so intense that blood would pour from his nose and ears until they retreated to safer ground. The investigation was quietly abandoned when Sheriff Stone's own daughter began experiencing what he called episodes. The girl, normally healthy and vibrant, would suddenly collapse during the day and lie motionless for hours with her eyes rolled back, speaking in voices that didn't belong to her. During these fits, she would describe the layout of the Ashford property in perfect detail despite never having been there, and share information about the family's activities that a child couldn't possibly know. Most disturbing, she would speak in the voices of the Cherokee women, describing their murders with a clarity and emotional weight that suggested she was somehow experiencing their final moments. By 1845, the Ashford clan's influence had spread throughout the valley like a spiritual plague that infected everything it touched. Families found themselves compelled to leave small offerings at the boundaries of their properties, bundles of food or handmade items that would disappear overnight. Those who refused to participate in this informal tribute system suffered a series of misfortunes, so specific and devastating that even the most skeptical began to believe in supernatural intervention. Wells would run dry despite plentiful underground springs. Livestock would sicken and die despite perfect health the day before, and children would develop wasting illnesses that left them pale and listless. Speaking of dreams, where shadowy figures called to them from deep underground. The family's power seemed to center around their collection of human essence, gathered through decades of their twisted ceremonies and stored in what they called the vessel garden. This was a chamber carved into the limestone beneath their property, accessible only through the ritual well, where hundreds of skull vessels contained the captured life force and final memories of their victims. Local Cherokee elders, the few who hadn't been driven from the region by warfare and disease, spoke of this place in hushed tones as the place where souls go to be forgotten, warning that whatever dwelt in those depths fed on human suffering the way normal creatures fed on meat and grain. The end came suddenly in the spring of 1847, though not through any human intervention. A team of federal surveyors mapping the region for a proposed railroad route discovered Bone Creek Valley and immediately reported their findings to authorities in Frankfort. The survey team's official report, classified for 60 years before being quietly destroyed, described a scene that challenged their understanding of both geology and human behavior. The Ashford cabin was found empty but perfectly preserved, as if the family had simply vanished in the middle of their daily activities. All meals sat half-eaten on the table, with food that showed no signs of spoilage, despite having been abandoned for what appeared to be weeks. Children's toys were arranged in precise geometric patterns throughout the house, positioned according to some logic that made the surveyors physically sick when they tried to understand the underlying system. Most disturbing was the family's collection, carefully cataloged and stored in the wooden boxes they had brought from the East. Hundreds of glass vessels filled with what could only be human blood, each labeled with names and dates spanning over a decade. Collections of hair organized by color and texture with an obsessive attention to detail that suggested profound mental disturbance. jars containing what the surveyors could only describe as fragments of human shadow, dark substances that seemed to move independently of any light source and left those who observed them feeling as if something essential had been drained from their souls. But the most horrifying discovery was the journal kept by Samuel Ashford, written in a mixture of English and the strange symbols that appeared throughout their property. The journal revealed that the family hadn't simply been practicing isolated rituals, but had been preparing for something they called the Great Summoning. According to Samuel's writings, their decades of human sacrifice had been feeding an entity that existed in the spaces between life and death, something that had grown strong enough to cross permanently into the physical world if provided with sufficient nourishment and a suitable vessel for its manifestation. The final entries in the journal, dated just days before the surveyor's arrival, suggested that the Ashfords had achieved their ultimate goal. They had offered themselves as the final sacrifice, willingly allowing the entity they had served to consume their physical forms so that it could take permanent residence in the material realm. The survey team found evidence of this transformation in the limestone circle, where the stones had fused together into a single massive formation that pulsed with what appeared to be its own heartbeat and emanated a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight or any natural source of heat. The federal government's response was swift and decisive. The entire valley was declared a restricted area and sealed off from public access, officially due to dangerous geological instability that made the region unsuitable for railroad construction. All records of the Ashford family were removed from county archives, and the surviving members of the survey team were reassigned to distant territories with strict orders never to discuss what they had discovered. The limestone circle was dynamited and buried under tons of imported stone and concrete, though workers reported that the explosions seemed to be absorbed by the rock rather than destroying it, and the concrete never properly set, remaining perpetually damp and slightly warm to the touch. But sealing off Bone Creek Valley didn't end the Ashford legacy. The entity they had summoned remained active, and locals throughout eastern Kentucky began reporting phenomena that suggested its influence was spreading beyond the confines of its original prison. Children throughout the region began experiencing shared nightmares about a family with pale eyes who stood in limestone circles and beckoned them to join their eternal service. These children would wake speaking in voices that didn't belong to them, sharing knowledge of events that had occurred decades before their birth, and displaying an unsettling familiarity with death and suffering that no child should possess. More disturbing were the reports of visitors who claimed to encounter members of the Ashford family in various locations throughout the mountains. These figures appeared normal at first glance, but cast no shadows and left no footprints, speaking to travelers about the beauty of surrendering individual identity to become part of something larger and more permanent. Those who engaged with these apparitions often reported feeling an overwhelming compulsion to seek out Bone Creek Valley, describing the sensation as being called home by voices I've been waiting my whole life to hear. The Ashford clan represents something that challenges our understanding of human evil and spiritual corruption. They weren't simply a family that practiced dark rituals, but served as conduits for forces that exist beyond our comprehension of reality itself. Their legacy reminds us that in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains keep their oldest secrets, some hungers are too ancient to die, and some summons, once issued, can never be withdrawn. The limestone circle may be buried beneath tons of concrete and stone, but according to those who monitor the site, the entity that Ashford summoned still pulses in the darkness below, patient and eternal, waiting for someone desperate enough to dig down and discover what lies beneath. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the fog rolls thick through the mountains, locals report hearing voices calling from the direction of the sealed valley, speaking in the tongues of the Cherokee women and promising answers to life's deepest questions for those brave enough to listen. The voices are beautiful, they say, more beautiful than any earthly music, and they promise that the pain of living can be transformed into something pure and eternal for those willing to join the congregation that waits in the darkness below. Deep in the fog-shrouded mountains of eastern Tennessee, where cell signals die and GPS coordinates seem to shift when you're not looking, there exists a valley that doesn't appear on any government map. The locals who remember the old stories call it Weeping Bone Hollow, though few will speak the name after dark. It was here in 1826 that the Grimwald family first settled, arriving during a winter so brutal that even the Cherokee avoided traveling through the region. What the scattered mountain families didn't understand was that the Grimwalds hadn't come seeking refuge from civilization. They had come running from something far worse than poverty or persecution, carrying with them practices so ancient and twisted that they would transform their isolated valley into a place where the very laws of nature seemed negotiable. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong appeared within weeks of the family's arrival. Matthias Grimwald, the patriarch, was a skeletal man with hollow cheeks and eyes so pale they seemed almost transparent in certain light. His wife, Constance, spoke only in whispers and had the unsettling habit of staring at pregnant women with an intensity that made them physically ill. Their 6 children, ranging in age from 8 to 19, moved with an eerie synchronization that made neighboring families deeply uncomfortable, as if they shared some invisible connection that allowed them to communicate without words. But it was their nocturnal activities that first aroused suspicion. Every new moon, when Weeping Bone Hollow lay shrouded in absolute darkness, strange lights could be seen dancing between the trees near the Grimwald property. These weren't the warm glow of lanterns or campfires, but cold, blue-white illuminations that seemed to move with deliberate purpose through the forest. Local hunters began avoiding the area entirely after their dogs would refuse to track game anywhere near the Grimwald land, whimpering and cowering whenever they approached the invisible boundary that seemed to surround the family's territory. What no one realized was that the Grimwalds practiced something they called the harvesting, a ritual tradition that involved the systematic collection and preservation of human suffering. Every dark moon, the family would gather in a natural amphitheater hidden deep in their property, where a ring of standing stones created a perfect circle around what appeared to be a natural well. These stones, according to Cherokee legends that the white settlers had dismissed as primitive superstition, marked one of the wound places where the earth itself had been scarred by ancient tragedies so profound that they had left permanent marks on the landscape. The ritual itself was methodical and horrifying in its complexity. Each family member would take their designated position around the stone circle, with Matthias standing at the center beside the well that descended into the limestone bedrock. The opening was roughly 8 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, and according to later geological surveys, impossibly deep. Matthias would begin by reading from a collection of human skin parchments covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light of the bone torches that provided the only illumination during these ceremonies. The offerings began with animals, usually livestock stolen from neighboring farms during the darkest nights when families slept deeply and trusted in their isolation for protection. But the Grimwalds didn't simply sacrifice these creatures in some crude ritual. Instead, they performed what they called the extraction, a process where they would use specially forged copper tools to make precise incisions that allowed the animal's life essence to drain slowly into vessels carved from human skulls. These vessels, decorated with symbols that caused temporary blindness in those who stared too long, would then be poured into the well while the family chanted in a language that predated any known human tongue. As the months passed and the rituals grew more elaborate, the entity they served began to demand increasingly complex offerings. By 1828, the family had begun incorporating human elements into their ceremonies. At first, it was just hair and nail clippings, collected from the homes of their neighbors during social visits, or stolen from the small cemetery that served the scattered mountain community. Constance had developed a particular talent for this collection, moving through houses like a phantom while families attended church services or worked in distant fields, gathering these personal remnants that she would later weave into elaborate patterns during the dark moon ceremonies. The true horror of the Grimwald practices didn't become apparent until the autumn of 1830, when a circuit preacher named Reverend Isaiah Blackwood made the mistake of staying too long in their valley and asking too many questions about the family's mysterious activities. Blackwood had been ministering to isolated mountain communities for over 15 years and prided himself on understanding the peculiar ways of the hill folk, but something about the Grimwalds disturbed him in ways he couldn't articulate. When he mentioned to other families that he'd heard strange singing coming from the direction of Weeping Bone Hollow during his evening prayers, several people warned him to mind his own business and move on to the next settlement immediately. Blackwood should have heeded their urgent advice. Instead, driven by what he later described in his journal as a divine compulsion to confront evil wherever it festered, he decided to investigate the family's midnight activities personally. On the night of October's new moon, he concealed himself among the dense underbrush near the stone circle, planning to gather evidence of whatever ungodly practices were taking place in the darkness. What he witnessed that night was recorded in a journal found decades later among his possessions, pages that were stained with what appeared to be tears, blood, and something else that defied scientific identification. According to Blackwood's increasingly frantic account, the Grimwald family had captured 3 young women from a traveling family who had made the mistake of asking for shelter during a sudden mountain storm. The women were bound to stakes driven into the ground at specific points around the circle, positioned according to some geometric pattern that Blackwood said made his eyes water and his mind reel when he tried to follow its logic. What followed was a ceremony that Blackwood described as an abomination that would make the devils themselves weep with horror and envy. The family didn't simply murder the women. Instead, they performed the extraction on human subjects, using their copper tools to make incisions that followed what Blackwood called the hidden rivers of life that flow beneath mortal flesh. As the women's life force drained into the skull vessels, the standing stones themselves began to change. The rock grew darker, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, and from the depths of the well came sounds that Blackwood described as the voices of every soul that had ever been lost to despair, crying out in harmonies that spoke of hungers older than creation itself. But the most terrifying moment came when the women's lives finally ended. According to Blackwood's journal, they didn't simply die. Instead, their voices continued speaking, but the words came from the stones themselves, as if their essence had been absorbed into the very rock. The stone circle began to whisper in the women's voices, sharing secrets about the people of the valley, revealing hidden shames and buried sins with knowledge that no living person could possess. The stones spoke of children who would be born twisted, of crops that would fail for generations, of madness that would claim entire bloodlines, all in voices that carried the musical cadence of the murdered women. Blackwood fled that night, but not before Matthias Grimwald looked directly at his hiding spot and smiled with an expression that the preacher said held more knowledge of human suffering than any mortal soul should possess, and more satisfaction in that knowledge than any creature of God could bear. The family made no immediate move to pursue him, seemingly content to let him carry the memory of what he had witnessed back into the world beyond their valley. Blackwood never made it to the next settlement. His body was discovered 6 days later by a search party, found sitting upright against a tree at the mouth of Weeping Bone Hollow, exactly as if he were still watching something in the distance. There were no wounds on his corpse, no signs of violence or struggle, but his hair had turned completely white, and his fingernails had grown to an impossible length, as if weeks had passed in the few days since his disappearance. Most disturbing was the expression frozen on his face, not one of terror, but of understanding, as if in his final moments he had comprehended something so profound and terrible that it had simply stopped his heart from beating. The local constable, a practical man named William Stone, who had dealt with mountain feuds and isolated violence for 20 years, tried to investigate Blackwood's death, but found himself strangely reluctant to venture too deep into Weeping Bone Hollow. Every time he approached the Grimwald property, he reported feeling an overwhelming sense of being observed by invisible eyes that seemed to count his heartbeats and measure the warmth of his blood. His deputy, James Crawford, developed severe migraines whenever they got within 3 miles of the family's homestead, migraines so intense that blood would pour from his nose and ears until they retreated to safer ground. The investigation was quietly abandoned when Constable Stone's own daughter began experiencing what he called visitations. The girl, normally healthy and vibrant, would suddenly collapse during the day and lie motionless for hours with her eyes rolled back, speaking in voices that didn't belong to her. During these episodes, she would describe the layout of the Grimwald property in perfect detail despite never having been there, and share information about the family's activities that a child couldn't possibly know. Most disturbing, she would speak in the voices of the murdered women, describing their final moments with a clarity and emotional weight that suggested she was somehow experiencing their terror and agony firsthand. By 1832, the Grimwald clan's influence had spread throughout the valley like a spiritual plague that infected everything it touched. Families found themselves compelled to leave small offerings at the boundaries of their properties, bundles of food or handmade items that would disappear overnight. Those who refused to participate in this informal tribute system suffered a series of misfortunes, so specific and devastating that even the most skeptical began to believe in supernatural intervention. Wells would run dry despite plentiful underground springs. Livestock would sicken and die despite perfect health the day before, and children would develop wasting illnesses that left them pale and listless. Speaking of dreams, where shadowy figures called to them from deep underground. The family's power seemed to center around their collection of human essence, gathered through decades of their twisted ceremonies and stored in what they called the repository of sorrows. This was a chamber carved into the limestone beneath their property, accessible only through the ritual well, where hundreds of skull vessels contained the captured life force and final memories of their victims. Local Cherokee elders, the few who hadn't been driven from the region by disease and warfare, spoke of this place in hushed tones as the place where weeping never ends, warning that whatever dwelt in those depths fed on human anguish the way normal creatures fed on meat and grain. The end came suddenly in the spring of 1834, though not through any human intervention. A team of federal surveyors mapping the region for a proposed territorial road discovered Weeping Bone Hollow and immediately reported their findings to authorities in Nashville. The survey team's official report, classified for 50 years before being quietly destroyed, described a scene that challenged their understanding of both human behavior and the physical laws that governed reality itself. The Grimwald homestead was found empty but perfectly preserved, as if the family had simply vanished in the middle of their daily activities. Meals sat half-eaten on the table, with food that showed no signs of spoilage, despite having been abandoned for what appeared to be weeks. Children's clothing was arranged in precise geometric patterns throughout the house, positioned according to some logic that made the surveyors physically sick when they tried to understand the underlying system. Most disturbing was the family's collection, carefully cataloged and stored in specially constructed cabinets. Hundreds of glass vessels filled with what could only be human blood, each labeled with names and dates spanning over 8 years. Collections of hair organized by color and texture with an obsessive attention to detail that suggested profound mental disturbance. Jars containing what the surveyors could only describe as fragments of human shadow, dark substances that seemed to move independently of any light source, and left those who observed them feeling as if something essential had been drained from their souls. But the most horrifying discovery was the journal kept by Matthias Grimwald, written in a mixture of English and the strange symbols that appeared throughout their property. The journal revealed that the family hadn't simply been practicing isolated rituals, but had been preparing for something they called the Great Communion. According to Matthias's writings, their years of human sacrifice had been feeding an entity that existed in the spaces between life and death, something that had grown strong enough to cross permanently into the physical world if provided with sufficient nourishment and suitable vessels for its manifestation. The final entries in the journal, dated just days before the surveyor's arrival, suggested that the Grimwalds had achieved their ultimate goal. They had offered themselves as the final sacrifice, willingly allowing the entity they had served to consume their physical forms so that it could take permanent residence in the material realm. The survey team found evidence of this transformation in the stone circle where the standing stones had fused together into a single massive formation that pulsed with what appeared to be its own heartbeat and emanated a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight or any natural source of heat. The federal government's response was swift and decisive. The entire valley was declared a restricted area and sealed off from public access, officially due to dangerous geological instability that made the region unsuitable for road construction. All records of the Grimwald family were removed from territorial archives, and the surviving members of the survey team were reassigned to distant territories with strict orders never to discuss what they had discovered. The stone circle was dynamited and buried under tons of imported granite and concrete, though workers reported that the explosions seemed to be absorbed by the rock rather than destroying it, and the concrete never properly set, remaining perpetually damp and slightly warm to the touch. But sealing off Weeping Bone Hollow didn't end the Grimwald legacy. The entity they had summoned remained active, and locals throughout eastern Tennessee began reporting phenomena that suggested its influence was spreading beyond the confines of its original prison. Children throughout the region began experiencing shared nightmares about a family with pale eyes who stood in stone circles and beckoned them to join their eternal service. These children would wake speaking in voices that didn't belong to them, sharing knowledge of events that had occurred decades before their birth, and displaying an unsettling familiarity with death and suffering that no child should possess. The Grimwald clan represents something that challenges our understanding of human evil and spiritual corruption. They weren't simply a family that practiced dark rituals, but served as conduits for forces that exist beyond our comprehension of reality itself. Their legacy reminds us that in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains keep their oldest secrets, some hungers are too ancient to die, and some summons, once issued, can never be withdrawn. The stone circle may be buried beneath tons of concrete and granite, but according to those who monitor the site, the entity the Grimwalds summoned still pulses in the darkness below, patient and eternal, waiting for someone desperate enough to dig down and discover what lies beneath. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the fog rolls thick through the mountains, locals report hearing voices calling from the direction of the sealed valley, speaking in the tongues of the murdered women and promising answers to life's deepest questions for those brave enough to listen. The voices are beautiful, they say, more beautiful than any earthly music, and they promise that the pain of living can be transformed into something pure and eternal for those willing to join the congregation that waits in the darkness below. Because in these ancient mountains, some offerings once made can never be taken back, and some doors once opened can never truly be closed. Deep in the shadow of Blood Mountain, where the Georgia pines grow so thick that noon feels like twilight, the Ashford family built their compound in 1834 on land that even the Cherokee had marked as forbidden ground. They came fleeing accusations of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts, but what they practiced in those remote hollows made their former neighbors' suspicions seem quaint by comparison. The Ashfords weren't running from their dark arts. They were seeking the perfect place to perfect them. And in the ancient forests of Appalachia, where mist clung to the valleys like smoke from sacrificial fires, they found exactly what they'd been searching for. Ezekiel Ashford, the family patriarch, possessed eyes so pale they seemed colorless, and hands that never quite stopped trembling, as if some invisible current constantly flowed through his fingers. His wife, Constance, spoke only in whispers, and their 7 children moved through the forest with an unnatural silence that made even the wildlife uneasy. But it was their youngest daughter, Mercy, who would become the most feared member of a family that neighbors eventually stopped mentioning by name. The Ashford compound consisted of 13 cabins arranged in a perfect circle around a central clearing where no grass would grow, no matter how much rain fell or how fertile the surrounding soil appeared. Each cabin served a specific purpose: living quarters, storage for their peculiar implements, and chambers for rituals that local folklore would eventually describe as the workings that made the mountain itself weep. From the moment they arrived, strange things began happening in the surrounding area. Livestock born within 5 miles of their property emerged with deformities, extra limbs, eyes that reflected light like mirrors, or skin that pulsed with visible veins beneath transparent flesh. Hunters reported finding deer arranged in geometric patterns, their bodies drained of blood but showing no wounds. Most disturbing were the sounds that echoed from Blood Mountain on nights when the moon was dark, rhythmic chanting in a language that predated any known human settlement in the region. The family's first documented ritual took place during the winter solstice of 1835, witnessed by a Cherokee brave named Running Wolf who had been tracking a wounded bear near their territory. Hidden in the dense undergrowth, he watched as the entire Ashford clan gathered naked in their central clearing despite the freezing temperature. Each family member carried a different item: animal bones carved with symbols, clay vessels filled with dark liquids, and bundles of herbs that released acrid smoke when burned. At the center of the clearing, they had constructed an altar from stones that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it. Ezekiel began the ceremony by slicing his palm and allowing drops of blood to fall onto each stone, while reciting words that Running Wolf later claimed made the trees lean away in fear. One by one, each family member contributed blood to the altar, but Mercy's offering was different. When she cut her hand, the blood that flowed was not red, but black as pitch, and where it touched the ground, the very earth seemed to recoil. What happened next would haunt Running Wolf for the rest of his short life. The family began to change. Their skin grew pale and translucent, revealing networks of dark veins beneath. Their eyes became completely black, reflecting the firelight like polished obsidian. Most terrifying of all, they began to move in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single consciousness that existed somewhere beyond individual thought. The ritual reached its climax when Constance approached the altar, carrying something wrapped in white cloth. She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a newborn baby, not one of theirs, but clearly human. Running Wolf later swore the infant was still alive when they placed it on the altar, though it made no sound as Ezekiel raised a curved blade that seemed to drink in the firelight. Running Wolf fled before witnessing the sacrifice's completion, but the Cherokee tribe found his body 3 days later, aged decades beyond his actual years. His hair turned completely white, and his eyes clouded with cataracts. Before dying, he managed to whisper a warning that the tribal elders would remember for generations. They are not feeding themselves, they are feeding something that sleeps beneath the mountain. As years passed, the Ashford's influence spread through the region like a supernatural plague. Children began disappearing from isolated cabins, always taken on nights when no moon shone. The victims were never found, but search parties occasionally discovered small shrines hidden in the deepest parts of the forest, crude altars decorated with personal items belonging to the missing children and surrounded by symbols carved into living trees. Local ministers attempted to organize efforts against the family, but their congregations dwindled as members either moved away or simply vanished. Father Mackenzie, who had served the mountain communities for over 20 years, wrote in his final journal entry before disappearing in 1842, "I have seen what dwells with the Ashfords, and it is not of this world. They have made a covenant with something ancient and hungry, something that demands payment in innocent blood. God help us all, for I fear he cannot hear our prayers from this cursed place." The family's most notorious ritual occurred annually on the night of the blood moon, when lunar eclipses cast the mountain in an eerie red glow. On these nights, witnesses reported seeing dozens of figures moving through the forest toward the Ashford compound, not just family members, but others who had fallen under their influence. These converts, known locally as the Hollow Ones, moved with the same unnatural synchronization as the Ashfords themselves, their eyes reflecting the crimson moonlight like burning coals. During one such gathering in 1847, a traveling preacher named Jeremiah Stone attempted to infiltrate the ceremony, believing he could document their practices and expose them to authorities. Hidden in a tree overlooking their clearing, he watched as nearly 50 people participated in a ritual that defied human understanding. The Ashfords had constructed a massive bonfire in the center of their circle, but the flames burned with colors that had no names: deep purples, sickly greens, and blues so dark they seemed to absorb light from the surrounding area. Around this otherworldly fire, the participants danced in patterns that hurt to observe directly, their movements creating optical illusions that made Stone's eyes water and his vision blur. At the ritual's peak, the earth itself began to respond. The ground beneath the fire cracked open, revealing a chasm that descended far deeper than should have been possible. From this pit rose sounds that Stone described as the breathing of something vast and malevolent, something that had been sleeping since before human memory began. Young Mercy Ashford, now in her 20s but appearing ageless, approached the chasm carrying a series of wooden cages containing live animals, rabbits, squirrels, and what appeared to be a human infant. One by one, she lowered these offerings into the pit, and each time the breathing sounds grew louder and more urgent. The assembled crowd swayed in unison, their chanting reaching a crescendo that made the very mountains echo. Stone fled during the ceremony's climax, but not before witnessing something that would shatter his faith forever. As the final offering disappeared into the chasm, something began to emerge. He caught only a glimpse, a mass of writhing darkness that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process, before his mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. He was found wandering the forest 3 weeks later, his hair completely white and his speech reduced to incoherent warnings about the thing that climbs from below and the family that feeds the ancient hunger. Stone spent his remaining years in an asylum, drawing obsessively on the walls with his own blood, always the same image of a pit surrounded by figures with hollow, staring eyes. By the 1850s, the Ashfords' reputation had spread throughout the Appalachian region, but their influence had grown so strong that few dared speak openly against them. Entire communities had been abandoned as families fled the area, leaving behind empty cabins and small cemeteries where too many graves belonged to children who had died under mysterious circumstances. The family themselves seemed to have transcended normal human limitations. Neighbors reported that the Ashfords never appeared to age, never fell ill, and possessed strength and endurance that defied natural explanation. Mercy could allegedly lift grown men with one hand, while Ezekiel was said to be able to see in complete darkness and hear conversations from miles away. Their most unsettling ability, however, was their apparent influence over the natural world itself. Trees withered when they passed, streams changed course to avoid their property, and even the weather seemed to bend to their will. Locals claimed that the Ashfords could summon storms or drought, bring plague to their enemies' livestock, or cause the very ground to open up and swallow those who opposed them. The end of the Ashford reign came not through human intervention, but from something far more ancient and terrible. In the winter of 1859, a geologist named Dr. Harrison Wells arrived in the region to investigate reports of unusual mineral formations near Blood Mountain. His academic interest in the area's geology led him to survey the land around the Ashford compound, where his equipment detected massive underground caverns that extended far deeper than any natural formation should exist. Dr. Wells's detailed measurements revealed that these caverns formed a complex network centered directly beneath the Ashford clearing, with tunnels radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. More disturbing was his discovery that the cavern walls were covered with symbols identical to those found carved into trees throughout the forest, symbols that predated any known human presence in the region by thousands of years. On his final night in the area, Dr. Wells witnessed the Ashfords' last ritual. From his hidden position, he observed the family gathering around their altar as they had for decades, but this time something was different. The earth began to tremble, and the pit that opened beneath their feet glowed with an inner light that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. But instead of offering sacrifices to whatever dwelt below, the Ashfords themselves began to descend into the chasm. One by one, they walked into the pit as if answering some unheard summons, their faces serene and their movements willing. Mercy was the last to go, pausing at the edge to look directly at Dr. Wells's hiding place. She smiled, a expression of such profound evil that he would see it in nightmares for the rest of his life, before stepping into the darkness and disappearing forever. The pit closed behind them, leaving no trace of the family that had terrorized the mountain for 25 years. But their legacy lived on in the hollows and hidden places of Appalachia, where locals still find their carved symbols appearing on trees overnight, where children still vanish during blood moons, and where something ancient and hungry still waits beneath Blood Mountain, patient and eternal, fed by decades of sacrifice, and sustained by the dark covenant the Ashfords forged in those mist-shrouded hills where even God's light struggles to penetrate the darkness. Deep in the fog-shrouded hollers of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains seem to swallow sunlight whole and morning mist clings to the valleys like the breath of sleeping giants, the Grimwald family carved out their existence in a place that even the Cherokee had marked as cursed ground. They arrived in 1854, fleeing something in the old country that they never spoke of, carrying with them traditions that predated Christianity by centuries, and practices that would make the mountain itself recoil in horror. Jacob Grimwald stood nearly 7 feet tall, his frame gaunt as winter branches, with eyes the color of storm clouds and hands that never stopped trembling, as if some invisible current constantly flowed through his fingers. His wife, Margaret, moved through their compound like a specter, her feet never seeming to quite touch the ground, while their 5 children possessed an otherworldly beauty that made visitors deeply uncomfortable, though none could explain exactly why. The family settled in a hollow so remote that even seasoned hunters avoided it, claiming their compasses spun wildly and their dogs refused to track game past a certain boundary marked by ancient stones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Grimwalds built their homestead around a natural depression in the earth where nothing would grow, a barren circle roughly 30 feet across that locals would later call the Hungry Ground. What made the Grimwalds truly terrifying wasn't their isolation or their strange appearance, but their ability to make people disappear without anyone remembering they had ever existed. Unlike other mountain families, who might kill to protect their secrets, the Grimwalds possessed something far more insidious. They could erase a person from memory itself, as if that individual had never been born. The first documented case occurred in the winter of 1856, though documented might be too strong a word. Martha Henderson, the valley's midwife and unofficial keeper of family records, noticed a discrepancy in her carefully maintained ledgers. She had entries for the birth of 7 children to the Whitmore family, but when she visited their cabin, she found only 6 children and parents who insisted they'd never had a 7th child. More disturbing still, Martha herself couldn't remember delivering that 7th child, despite her own handwriting clearly recording the birth. This pattern repeated throughout the region with increasing frequency. Families would wake to find empty beds in their homes, with no memory of who had slept there. Wedding photos would show mysterious figures that no one could identify, standing beside people who swore they had married alone. Census records became unreliable as names appeared and disappeared between official counts, leaving bureaucrats scratching their heads over phantom populations that existed only on paper. The Grimwald's most sacred ritual took place during the new moon, when darkness lay thick across the mountains like a burial shroud. On these nights, they would gather around the barren circle that dominated their property, bringing with them someone who had been carefully selected from the surrounding communities. The selection process itself was supernatural in nature. The Grimwalds seemed to know instinctively who could be taken without disrupting the delicate web of human connection that bound mountain communities together. They preferred isolated individuals, widows without close family, drifters passing through the region, children who had been born out of wedlock and existed on the margins of society. These were people whose absence might be noticed briefly, but wouldn't tear holes in the social fabric that were too large to mend. The Grimwalds understood that their power worked best when it didn't have to fight against too many competing memories. The ritual itself defied human understanding. Witnesses, though finding witnesses proved nearly impossible given the nature of the Grimwald's power, described a ceremony that seemed to involve unmaking the very concept of existence. The family would arrange themselves in a perfect circle around their chosen victim, who stood motionless in the center of the barren ground as if held there by invisible chains. Jakob would begin with an incantation in a language that predated any known human tongue, words that seemed to bend reality around them as they were spoken. As he chanted, the victim would begin to fade, not physically at first, but conceptually. Their shadow would disappear even though they still stood in moonlight. Their reflection would vanish from any surface that might have held it. Their footprints would unmake themselves, leaving no trace of their passage. Margaret would add her voice to the chanting, her words weaving around her husband's like dark threads on an impossible loom. As she spoke, the memories of the victim would begin to unravel. Anyone who had ever known them would find those recollections growing dim and confused, as if trying to remember a dream upon waking. Conversations held with the victim would seem like half-remembered dialogues with shadows. Moments shared would feel like scenes from stories heard long ago rather than lived experiences. The children's role in the ceremony was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire ritual. Each child would place their hand on a different part of the victim's body: head, heart, hands, feet, and throat, serving as conduits for the family's power. Through their touch, they would drain away not just the victim's life force, but their very existence. The person would fade from reality layer by layer, first becoming invisible to strangers, then to acquaintances, then to friends, and finally even to family members. But the Grimwalds didn't simply kill these people, they consumed their existence entirely, adding the victim's life force to their own family's unnatural longevity. Jakob, despite appearing to be in his 40s, had been seen by various witnesses across the region for over a century. Margaret's beauty never faded, remaining as ethereal and terrible as the day she first arrived. Their children never seemed to age, maintaining the same otherworldly appearance decade after decade. The power came with a terrible hunger that grew stronger with each feeding. The family found themselves needing to perform the ritual more frequently as the years passed, taking people not just for survival, but to satisfy an addiction to the act of unmaking existence itself. They became connoisseurs of erasure, developing preferences for different types of memories and experiences to consume. They particularly favored taking people who had lived rich, full lives, savoring the complex web of relationships and experiences that they could slowly unravel. A beloved teacher would vanish, leaving behind classrooms full of students who couldn't quite remember who had taught them to read. A devoted parent would disappear, and their children would grow up with a vague sense that someone important was missing from their lives without being able to identify what or who. The mountain communities began to adapt to this supernatural predation in ways that defied rational explanation. Families started keeping detailed written records of their members, not trusting memory alone. Mothers would carve their children's names into furniture and walls, creating physical anchors for relationships that might otherwise be severed by the Grimwald's influence. Some people developed a practice of taking daily photographs, though these images often showed mysterious gaps where people should have been. Local folklore evolved to include warnings about the forgetting family and rituals designed to protect against memory theft. Salt was scattered around doorways, not to keep out evil spirits, but to maintain the clarity of recollection. Mirrors were covered during new moon nights, as reflections were believed to make people more vulnerable to being unmade. Children were taught never to venture out alone after dark, and to always travel in groups large enough that someone would remember if a person vanished. The Grimwald's reign of terror reached its peak in the 1890s when they began targeting entire families rather than isolated individuals. The Thornberry clan, a family of 7 that had farmed the same plot of land for 3 generations, simply ceased to exist over the course of a single winter. Their cabin stood empty, but neighbors couldn't remember who had lived there. The local preacher found marriage records in his church books for people whose names meant nothing to him. Children spoke of playmates who had vanished not just from sight, but from memory itself. This escalation proved to be the Grimwald's undoing. By consuming too much too quickly, they destabilized the very fabric of reality in their region. The constant erasure of existence began to create gaps in the world itself, places where nothing had ever been, holes in the landscape that the eye couldn't quite focus on. Trees would grow in impossible configurations, avoiding spaces where something important had once stood. Streams would bend around areas that appeared empty but felt occupied. The end came not through human intervention, but through the mountain's own defense mechanisms. The land itself began to reject the Grimwald's presence, recognizing them as a cancer that threatened the continuity of existence. Roads leading to their hollow would subtly redirect travelers away from their destination. Compasses would spin when pointed toward their homestead. Even memories of the location began to fade, making it increasingly difficult for the family to find their way home. On the night of the new moon in October 1897, the Grimwalds performed their final ritual. But instead of erasing another victim from existence, they found their power turning inward. The mountain had learned their techniques, absorbed their methods through decades of witnessing their ceremonies. Now it used those same powers against them, slowly unmaking the family that had unmade so many others. Jakob was the first to fade, his imposing figure growing translucent as his own memories began to unravel. Margaret followed, her ethereal beauty dissolving like morning mist. One by one, the children disappeared, not into death, but into the same void they had created for their victims. Their homestead remained, but it became impossible to remember who had lived there, or why anyone would build in such a cursed location. The Grimwald's legacy lived on in the gaps they left behind, the missing spaces in family photographs, the names carved into tombstones that no one could remember, the persistent feeling among mountain folk that something important had been lost but could never be recalled. Even today, genealogists working in eastern Kentucky encounter mysteries that can't be explained. Family trees with missing branches, birth records that reference people who left no other trace, and local histories that feel incomplete in ways that researchers can sense but never quite identify. The hollow where the Grimwalds once lived remains empty, though finding it proves remarkably difficult. GPS systems malfunction in the area, leading hikers in circles. Local maps show inconsistencies, with some including landmarks that others omit entirely. Those who do stumble upon the location report finding only the barren circle where nothing grows, surrounded by the foundations of buildings that no one can remember the purpose of. And sometimes, on new moon nights, when the darkness lies thick across the mountains, visitors to that cursed hollow report seeing faint figures moving around the empty ground, continuing their ritual of erasure, even in their unmade state, forever hungry for existence to consume and memories to steal from a world that has learned to forget them in return. Deep in the fog-shrouded valleys of eastern Tennessee, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels guarding secrets too terrible for daylight, the Mordecai family established their domain in 1842 on land that even the Cherokee had abandoned centuries before. They came not as settlers seeking new opportunities, but as exiles fleeing something far worse than poverty or persecution. What they brought with them would transform a remote hollow into a place where the very fabric of reality seemed negotiable and where the boundary between life and death became little more than a suggestion. Silas Mordecai stood nearly 8 feet tall, his frame so gaunt that his clothes hung like burial shrouds, and his eyes held a luminescence that seemed to glow with inner fire even in broad daylight. His wife, Temperance, moved through their compound with the fluid grace of something that had learned to mimic human movement but had never quite mastered it. Their 7 children possessed an otherworldly beauty that made visitors deeply uncomfortable, though none could articulate exactly why. The sight of these pale, ethereal beings filled them with such profound unease. The family settled in a place locals called Bone Hollow, a narrow valley where nothing had grown for as long as anyone could remember. The soil itself seemed cursed, a peculiar gray earth that felt cold to the touch even in summer, and gave off a faint metallic scent that made animals refuse to graze nearby. At the center of this barren landscape, the Mordecais built their homestead around a natural formation that defied geological explanation, a perfect circle of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. What made the Mordecai family truly terrifying wasn't their strange appearance or their choice of cursed ground, but their ability to manipulate death itself. Unlike other mountain families who might kill to protect their secrets, the Mordecais possessed something far more disturbing. They could bring the dead back to serve them, creating an army of the recently deceased who retained just enough of their former selves to make their existence a prolonged torment. The first documented case of the family's necromantic abilities occurred in the winter of 1844 when a traveling merchant named Jonas Fletcher arrived at their compound seeking shelter from a fierce blizzard. Fletcher was found 3 days later by a search party seated upright against a tree at the edge of Bone Hollow, his eyes staring sightlessly ahead and his skin bearing the unmistakable pallor of death. But when the searchers approached, Fletcher stood and began walking back toward the Mordecai homestead with the stiff, mechanical gait of a marionette controlled by invisible strings. The merchant continued to live in this state for several weeks, performing manual labor around the Mordecai property with tireless efficiency. Neighbors who glimpsed him from a distance reported that he moved without rest, working through storms and bitter cold with no apparent need for food, water, or sleep. The most disturbing of all, Fletcher seemed aware of his condition. Those who ventured close enough claimed they could see the desperate terror in his eyes, a consciousness trapped within a body that no longer belonged to him. This pattern repeated throughout the region with increasing frequency. Visitors to Bone Hollow would arrive alive and leave as something else entirely. The Mordecais seemed to prefer taking people who wouldn't be immediately missed, drifters, traveling salesmen, and those on the margins of mountain society. But as their confidence grew, so did their ambition. Entire families began disappearing, only to be seen weeks later working the Mordecai fields with the same mechanical precision, their children among them, all bearing the telltale signs of the walking dead. The family's most sacred ritual took place during the new moon, when darkness lay absolute across the hollow. On these nights, the Mordecais would gather around the circle of black stone, bringing with them their latest acquisition. The ceremony itself was a perversion of the natural order that seemed to offend the very earth on which it was performed. Silas would begin by carving intricate symbols into the victim's flesh while they still lived, using a blade forged from the same black material as the stone circle. As he worked, Temperance would recite incantations in a language that predated human speech, words that seemed to make the air itself recoil. The children would add their voices to the chanting, their youthful tones creating harmonies that hurt to hear. The victim, still conscious but unable to move due to some supernatural paralysis, would watch helplessly as their life force was slowly drained away and replaced with something else entirely. The transformation was gradual and horrifying. First, the victim's natural coloring would fade to a sickly gray. Then, their movements would become stilted and unnatural, as if they were learning to operate their own body for the first time. Their speech, when it came at all, was halting and mechanical, though their eyes retained enough awareness to convey the horror of their situation. Finally, their original personality would begin to fragment, replaced by an absolute obedience to the Mordecai family's will. But the family's power extended beyond simple necromancy. They had learned to refine their techniques, creating different types of servants for different purposes. Some of the dead retained more their original intelligence, making them useful for complex tasks or interactions with the living. Others were stripped of almost all consciousness, becoming little more than automated laborers. Most terrifying of all were those who retained their full awareness, but lost all ability to resist, forced to watch helplessly as their bodies performed acts their minds found abhorrent. The Mordecai's undead workforce allowed them to prosper in ways that seemed impossible given their remote location and barren land. Their fields, despite the cursed soil, produced bountiful harvests that they traded with distant communities. Their livestock, tended by tireless dead hands, multiplied and thrived. Most lucrative of all was their mining operation, where dozens of undead workers labored day and night in conditions that would have killed the living, extracting precious metals from veins that seemed to appear wherever they were needed. Local authorities, who attempted to investigate the strange reports from Bone Hollow, found themselves facing obstacles that transcended normal law enforcement challenges. Deputies who ventured too close to the Mordecai property would return with no memory of their visit, though they bore inexplicable injuries and spoke of nightmares filled with gray-skinned figures beckoning them into darkness. Those who persisted in their investigations would simply vanish, only to be seen months later among the ranks of the Mordecai's undead servants. The family's influence spread throughout the region like a supernatural plague. They began establishing trading relationships with other mountain communities, always sending their undead servants as intermediaries. These gray-skinned messengers would arrive at remote settlements with goods to trade and messages to deliver, but their very presence seemed to corrupt everything around them. Crops would wither in fields they passed through. Livestock would sicken and die. Children would wake screaming from nightmares about cold hands pulling them from their beds. More insidious was the family's recruitment strategy. The Mordecais learned that they could create a form of supernatural addiction in the living. People who spent extended time around their undead servants would develop a compulsive need to return to Bone Hollow. They would speak of feeling called by something in the mist-shrouded valley, describing an irresistible urge to walk among the gray-skinned workers and share in their eternal servitude. By the 1850s, the Mordecai family commanded an army of nearly 200 undead servants, each one a former resident of the surrounding mountains. Their compound had expanded into a sprawling necropolis where the living and the dead worked side by side though calling the reanimated corpses dead seemed increasingly inaccurate. They retained enough of their former selves to suffer, which appeared to be exactly what the Mordecais intended. The family's children, raised among the walking dead, developed abilities that surpassed even their parents' necromantic skills. The eldest daughter, Mercy, could animate corpses with nothing more than a whispered word. The twin boys, Cain and Abel, worked together to create more sophisticated undead, beings that could pass for living at a casual glance. Most disturbing was the youngest, a girl named Silence, who never spoke but could command the dead through thoughts alone. The end of the Mordecai reign came not through human intervention, but through their own hubris. In the winter of 1859, they attempted to raise something that should have remained buried. Deep beneath Bone Hollow lay the remains of whatever had originally cursed the land, something so ancient and malevolent that even the Cherokee had fled rather than face it. The Mordecais, drunk on their own power, decided to add this entity to their collection of servants. The ritual they performed on the winter solstice of 1859 was their most ambitious yet. Using the combined life force of 50 freshly killed victims, they attempted to reanimate whatever slept in the depths beneath their black stone circle. For a moment, they seemed to succeed. The ground cracked open, revealing a chasm that descended far deeper than seemed possible. From this pit arose something that defied description, a presence so vast and alien that merely looking upon it drove several of their undead servants into a catatonic state. But the entity they raised was not the mindless servant they expected. It was something far older and more powerful than the Mordecai family could possibly control. The moment it emerged fully from the earth, it turned its attention to its would-be masters. What followed was a brief but decisive battle between necromancers and the very source of their power. The Mordecais discovered too late that their abilities were merely borrowed fragments of this entity's true nature. It reclaimed what belonged to it with brutal efficiency, stripping away their powers and leaving them defenseless against the army of undead they had created. The servants, freed from supernatural compulsion but not from their unnatural existence, turned on their former masters with the fury of the eternally wronged. When dawn broke over Bone Hollow, nothing living remained. The Mordecai family had joined the ranks of their own servants, but with a crucial difference. They retained full awareness of their condition while possessing no ability to control it. They became prisoners in their own rotting bodies, forced to experience the same torment they had inflicted on others for nearly 2 decades. The entity that had destroyed them returned to its slumber beneath the earth, but it left the cursed valley intact as a warning. The undead servants, now masterless but still animated, dispersed into the surrounding mountains. Some simply collapsed where they stood, finally granted the rest they had been denied. Others wandered aimlessly through the forests, becoming the source of ghost stories and unexplained disappearances that persist to this day. Bone Hollow stands empty now, though empty might not be the correct word. The black stone circle remains, its surface scarred by the ritual that brought about the Mordecai's downfall. Local folklore claims that on certain nights, when the mist rolls thick through the valley, you can still see figures moving through the abandoned compound. Some say these are the lingering spirits of the Mordecai family, forever trapped in their cursed domain. Others believe they are the undead servants, still carrying out the final commands they received decades ago. What remains certain is that the land itself remembers what was done there. Hikers who venture too close to Bone Hollow report feeling watched by unseen eyes, hearing whispered voices calling their names, and experiencing an overwhelming urge to dig into the gray earth with their bare hands. Wildlife still avoids the area entirely, and plants refuse to grow in soil that continues to smell of metal and decay. The Mordecai legacy lives on in the gaps between life and death, in the spaces where the natural order was permanently broken by their dark ambitions. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the boundary between worlds grows thin, locals swear they can hear the sound of marching feet echoing from Bone Hollow, as if an army of the damned is still drilling for a war that will never come. Deep in the coal-scarred hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist clings to hollows like whispered secrets, the Harrow family built their empire on foundations that no decent person would dare examine. For over a century, they controlled 3 counties through a combination of political influence, economic stranglehold, and practices so disturbing that even hardened mountain folk cross themselves when speaking the Harrow name. The family patriarch, Silas Harrow, arrived in 1889 with nothing but a pregnant wife, twin sons, and a leather-bound journal written in symbols that resembled no known alphabet. Within 5 years, he owned the largest coal operation in the region, had founded the first bank of Thornfield, and constructed a mansion that locals whispered was built according to blueprints designed not by architects, but by something far older and more calculating. What made the Harrows different from other wealthy mountain families wasn't just their rapid accumulation of power, but the peculiar conditions that seemed to follow their success. Rival mining operations suffered catastrophic accidents with uncanny frequency. Competing banks faced runs that destroyed them overnight. Politicians who opposed Harrow interests died in hunting accidents or simply disappeared during routine trips to neighboring towns. But these public displays of influence masked something far more sinister happening within the Harrow estate itself, something that wouldn't be fully understood until a horrific discovery in 1987 finally exposed the family's true nature. The Harrow mansion sat on what locals called Bone Ridge, a limestone outcropping that had been considered cursed ground by the Cherokee long before European settlers arrived. The native tribes had marked the area with warning stones, claiming the hill was hollow underneath and that something hungry dwelt in those depths. Silas Harrow not only ignored these warnings, but seemed drawn to them, purchasing the land immediately upon his arrival and beginning construction within weeks. The mansion itself defied conventional architecture. From the outside, it appeared to be a standard Victorian structure with 3 stories and twin towers flanking the main entrance. But visitors reported becoming lost in corridors that seemed to change direction, finding rooms that hadn't existed moments before, and experiencing time distortions where hours would pass in what felt like minutes. The local craftsmen who worked on the building spoke of blueprints that shifted overnight, measurements that didn't match from day to day, and a growing sense that they were building something that wanted to be built. Most disturbing were the workers who vanished during construction. 7 men disappeared over the 2-year building period, always during night shifts, always without witnesses. Their families received generous compensation from Silas, along with strict instructions never to discuss the disappearances publicly. The completed mansion bore subtle evidence of their fate: support beams that contained suspicious dark stains, foundation stones that seemed to pulse with warmth in winter, and a basement level that extended much deeper than the building's footprint should have allowed. Silas Harrow's journal, discovered decades later during a police investigation, revealed the true purpose behind the mansion's unusual design. Written in a mixture of English and those strange symbols, the entries described communication with what he called the architects below, entities that provided him with knowledge in exchange for very specific forms of payment. These beings, according to Silas, existed in the spaces between solid matter in the limestone caverns that honeycombed the ridge, and they required periodic offerings to maintain their bargain with the Harrow family. The offerings began simply enough. Silas would descend into the mansion's sub-basement on nights of the new moon, carrying animals from his livestock: chickens at first, then pigs, eventually cattle. But the architects below grew more demanding as the family's influence expanded. They required offerings that could feel fear, that could understand what was happening to them, that could provide the specific type of spiritual energy they craved. By 1895, the Harrow family had established what they called the Thornfield Academy, a boarding school for children from troubled backgrounds. Orphans, runaways, and the unwanted offspring of mining families found themselves enrolled in this institution, which promised education, meals, and shelter in exchange for complete obedience to the Harrow family values. The Academy's curriculum included standard subjects like reading and arithmetic, but also courses in what the Harrows termed spiritual preparation and communion with ancient wisdom. The Academy children lived in dormitories built directly above the mansion's extended basement level. Former students who survived their education reported sleeping to the sound of rhythmic chanting from below, experiencing shared nightmares about vast underground chambers, and witnessing classmates who would disappear for days only to return changed, speaking in monotone voices about the beauty of dissolution and the honor of service to powers greater than human understanding. Martha Coldwell, who attended the Academy from 1901 to 1903 before fleeing during a particularly severe winter storm, later testified about the selection process that occurred each month. Silas Harrow would personally inspect all students during what he called worthiness evaluations. He would examine their hands, looking for specific markings or characteristics that indicated suitability for advanced study. Those selected would be taken to special classes held in the mansion's tower rooms, where they learned to meditate on geometric patterns carved into the walls and practice breathing exercises that involved inhaling smoke from herbs grown in the mansion's greenhouse. Martha described watching her roommate, a girl named Susan Mills, undergo this advanced training. Susan returned from these sessions with burn marks on her palms, arranged in perfect geometric patterns, eyes that had developed golden flecks in the irises, and an unsettling habit of staring at walls as though seeing through them into vast distances. After 3 weeks of this training, Susan informed Martha that she had been chosen for the highest honor, a special ceremony that would allow her to serve the family in ways that transcended normal human limitations. Susan Mills was never seen again, though Martha reported hearing her voice echoing from the basement levels for months afterward, speaking in languages that hurt to listen to, and calling for others to join her in what she described as the beautiful darkness that feeds on light. The Harrow family's influence continued to grow throughout the early decades of the 20th century. Their coal operations expanded into 3 states. Their banking interests extended throughout Appalachia, and their political connections reached all the way to the state capitals. But this expansion required increasingly elaborate offerings to maintain their supernatural bargain. The Thornfield Academy grew from 30 students to over 200, with new dormitories built in concentric circles around the original mansion, all connected by underground tunnels that allowed discreet movement of students to and from the central ritual spaces. Local ministers who attempted to investigate the academy faced systematic harassment that drove most from the area. Father Patrick O'Malley, who served the Catholic mission in Thornfield from 1908 to 1912, documented his experiences in letters to his bishop that were discovered in church archives in 1989. O'Malley described attending academy graduation ceremonies where students demonstrated abilities that seemed to violate natural law, moving objects without touching them, speaking in perfect unison despite being separated by large distances, and displaying knowledge of events occurring in distant locations at that exact moment. Most disturbing was O'Malley's account of the Harrow family's physical transformation over the years. Silas, who should have been aging normally, appeared to grow younger and more vital, while his sons developed elongated limbs and facial features that seemed subtly wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. Their skin took on a grayish pallor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their eyes developed the same golden flecks that marked their most devoted students. By 1920, the Harrow family had perfected their system of spiritual harvesting. The academy operated as a sophisticated selection and preparation facility, identifying children with specific psychological and physiological traits that made them suitable for communion with the architects below. These children underwent months of conditioning that broke down their individual personalities and rebuilt them as conduits for supernatural forces. The process was gradual enough that most students didn't realize what was happening until it was too late to resist. The family's ritual calendar followed astronomical events that amplified the spiritual energy they could harvest. During solar eclipses, they could perform ceremonies that affected entire counties, causing widespread crop failures that drove desperate families to sell their land to Harrow companies at below market prices. During lunar eclipses, they focused on individual transformations, creating servants whose human consciousness had been completely replaced by something that served the family's interests within human dedication. The end came in 1987, not through outside investigation or heroic intervention, but because the Harrow family finally overreached in their hunger for power. A former academy student named David Marsh, who had escaped the institution in 1975 and spent 12 years gathering evidence and allies, convinced federal authorities to investigate reports of missing children connected to the Thornfield Academy. When agents arrived with search warrants, they discovered that the mansion and academy buildings were completely empty. But what they found in the underground chambers beneath the ridge would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. The limestone caverns had been extensively modified, carved into a complex of ritual spaces that extended over half a mile into the mountain. The walls were covered with the same strange symbols found in Silas Harrow's journal, but these were carved deep into the rock and filled with a dark substance that analysis later identified as a mixture of coal dust, human blood, and minerals that don't exist in nature. At the center of the complex was a vast circular chamber containing the remains of hundreds of people arranged in concentric patterns around a stone altar that seemed to generate its own gravitational field. Most of the remains were children who had attended the academy over the decades, but investigators also found evidence of the missing construction workers, disappeared political opponents, and what appeared to be members of the Harrow family itself. Dental records confirmed that Silas Harrow and his descendants had ultimately been consumed by the same forces they had served, their human forms finally insufficient to contain the entities they had allowed to inhabit them. The investigation was classified almost immediately, the site sealed, and the surviving evidence transferred to federal facilities, where it remains locked away from public access. The official report cited unstable geological conditions and toxic contamination from illegal mining operations. The Thornfield Academy was demolished, the mansion burned, and the entire ridge was purchased by the federal government and designated as a protected wilderness area where public access is strictly forbidden. But the Harrow legacy didn't end with their physical destruction. Financial records revealed that their business empire had been systematically transferring assets to shell companies and trust funds for decades, as though preparing for their eventual disappearance. These financial networks continue to operate today, controlling mining rights, timber harvests, and real estate development throughout Appalachia. Local residents report that certain areas still feel wrong in ways they can't explain, that electronic equipment malfunctions near specific geographic coordinates, and that children sometimes disappear during camping trips in the national forest that now covers Bone Ridge. The most chilling evidence of the Harrow family's continuing influence comes from missing person reports filed in surrounding counties. Every few years, children with specific characteristics, unusual intelligence, artistic ability, and what psychologists term high empathic sensitivity vanish without trace from areas within 50 miles of the former Harrow estate. These disappearances follow no pattern that conventional law enforcement can identify, but they match exactly the selection criteria documented in Silas Harrow's journal for students suitable for advanced spiritual preparation. Whatever the Harrow family awakened in those limestone caverns, whatever bargain they struck with the architects below, it didn't end when their human forms were finally consumed. In the deepest parts of Appalachian darkness, where cell phones lose signal and GPS systems spin helplessly, something still waits with the patience of stone and the hunger of centuries, still honoring contracts written in blood and symbols that predate human civilization. The mountains remember what the Harrows taught them about the price of power, and they're still collecting payment from anyone foolish enough to venture too deep into places where the old agreements still hold force. Have you ever wondered what happens when desperate people make bargains they can't understand with forces they shouldn't contact? In the remote valleys of eastern Tennessee, where winter mist clings to ancient trees like ghostly fingers, The Ashford family discovered that some prices are too terrible to pay, yet impossible to escape. Picture this. It's 1889, and the Ashford clan has just suffered their third consecutive crop failure. Their children are starving, their livestock dying, and the mountain soil refuses to yield anything but withered plants and bitter disappointment. But what they're about to do in their desperation will curse their bloodline for over a century, creating a legacy so dark that even today, locals cross themselves when they hear the Ashford name whispered on the wind. The Ashford family arrived in Devil's Fork Valley in 1847, fleeing the Irish potato famine with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fierce determination to survive. For 40 years, they carved out a modest existence on the mountainside, raising 7 children and building a reputation as hardworking, God-fearing people. But the late 1880s brought disasters that tested their faith beyond breaking. First came the blight that turned their potato crops black and putrid. Then the corn withered on the stalk despite adequate rainfall. Their prize bull, the foundation of their small herd, was found dead without explanation, its eyes clouded white and its tongue swollen black. When their youngest daughter Mary fell into a wasting sickness that no mountain remedy could cure, Patriarch Sean Ashford reached the end of his endurance. It was old Henrik Volkov, a Russian trapper who occasionally traded pelts in the valley, who first mentioned the possibility of supernatural intervention. Henrik had wintered in the mountains for 3 decades, and the isolation had left him strange and prone to mumbling in languages no one recognized. But on a gray October morning in 1889, as Sean watched his daughter fade away to skin and bones, Henrik's words suddenly seemed less like the ravings of a madman and more like a lifeline. "There are older powers in these mountains," Henrik told Sean as they stood beside Mary's sickbed. "Powers that existed before your Christ walked the earth. They hunger for recognition, for worship, for sacrifice, but they can be generous to those who serve them properly." Henrik led Sean deep into the mountains, to a place where the trees grew in unnatural spirals and the ground was permanently soft, as though something large moved beneath the earth. At the center of this clearing stood a ring of 13 stones, each carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The stones were ancient, predating any known human settlement in the region, and they hummed with an energy that made Sean's teeth ache. "Your people called them the Seelie and Unseelie," Henrik explained, his accent thick and strange. "Others knew them as jinn, or demons, or nature spirits. The Cherokee who lived here before you called them the Nunahai, the people who live anywhere. But names don't matter. What matters is that they can save your daughter, your crops, your family's future, but they require commitment, total commitment." The ritual Henrik described was complex and horrifying. It would require blood from every family member, personal belongings that had been touched by the dying daughter, and a promise that could never be broken. The family would prosper, Henrik guaranteed, but they would belong to the powers beneath the mountain. Their children and their children's children would serve as guardians of ancient knowledge, protectors of secrets that civilization had forgotten. Sean returned home to find Mary barely breathing, her pulse so weak it could hardly be detected. His wife, Bridget, was weeping over their daughter's bed, while their 6 other children watched with hollow, hungry eyes. Outside, The first snows of winter were beginning to fall, and Sean knew they wouldn't survive until spring without some kind of intervention. That night, the entire Ashford family walked through the darkness to Henrik's stone circle. They performed the ritual exactly as the Russian had instructed, each family member cutting their palm and letting blood fall onto the ancient stones while speaking words in a language that predated English, Irish, or any tongue they'd ever heard. The stones grew warm beneath their touch, and the symbols carved into their surface began to glow with a sickly green light. Mary's recovery was immediate and complete. By morning, she was sitting up in bed asking for food, her cheeks flushed with health and her eyes bright with renewed life. But the changes that followed went far beyond a simple healing. The Ashford's failing crops suddenly flourished with impossible vigor. Vegetables grew to enormous sizes, their grain sprouted thick and golden, and their livestock multiplied at supernatural rates. Within 2 years, the Ashmores were the most prosperous family in 3 counties. Sean's eldest son, Patrick, discovered a vein of silver on their property that made them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But prosperity came with increasingly disturbing requirements. The entities Henrik had introduced them to demanded regular ceremonies, performed according to ancient rituals that grew more elaborate and dark with each passing season. The family learned to speak in the old tongue during these gatherings, chanting words that made reality bend around them. They discovered they could influence weather patterns, cause sickness in their enemies, and see events unfolding in distant places. But the powers they served were not benevolent. They fed on human suffering, and they expected the Ashford family to provide it. At first, the sacrifices were small: livestock, crops, personal possessions of great sentimental value. But as the years passed, the demands escalated. The entities wanted blood from unwilling victims, secrets stolen from neighboring families, and eventually, human lives. The first murder occurred in 1895. A traveling salesman named Marcus Webb had stopped at the Ashford farm seeking shelter during a thunderstorm. He was a pleasant man with a wife and children waiting for him in Knoxville, but the entities had spoken to Sean in his dreams, demanding that Webb's life force be offered to strengthen their connection to the physical world. The family lured Webb into the basement of their farmhouse, where they had constructed a ritual chamber beneath the foundation. The room was carved from solid rock and decorated with symbols that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. Webb's screams echoed through the mountains for 3 days before his spirit finally broke and the entities accepted his offering. Webb's murder established a pattern that would continue for decades. The Ashford family became skilled at identifying suitable victims: travelers, drifters, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. They developed techniques for luring these individuals to their property and methods for disposing of their remains that left no trace for authorities to discover. Each sacrifice strengthened the family's supernatural abilities while further binding them to their otherworldly masters. The children born to the Ashfords after 1889 possessed uncanny intuition, the ability to sense lies, and an immunity to most diseases. But they also inherited an insatiable hunger for power and a complete inability to feel genuine empathy for human suffering. By 1920, 3 generations of Ashfords had served the mountain entities, and their influence extended throughout eastern Tennessee. They controlled local politics through blackmail and supernatural manipulation, owned vast tracts of land acquired through mysterious circumstances, and operated businesses that prospered despite economic downturns that ruined their competitors. But their supernatural patrons demanded ever greater offerings. The entities had grown stronger over the decades, feeding on the suffering the Ashfords provided, and their appetite had increased accordingly. They began requiring multiple sacrifices each year, victims who were not random travelers, but specific individuals chosen for particular spiritual qualities. The family's hunting ground expanded beyond Devil's Fork Valley. They established a network of contacts throughout the region, identifying potential victims and tracking their movements. They learned to stage accidents, disappearances, and natural disasters that provided them with the human suffering their masters craved while maintaining plausible deniability. Local folklore began to reflect the Ashford family's dark influence. Children in surrounding communities were warned never to venture into Devil's Fork Valley after sunset. Hunters reported finding mutilated animal remains arranged in geometric patterns throughout the mountains. Several families abandoned their homes after experiencing recurring nightmares about pale figures with glowing eyes who spoke in languages that predated human civilization. The beginning of the end came in 1953 when young Timothy Ashford, great-grandson of the original Sean, experienced a crisis of conscience that would tear the family apart. Timothy had been raised in the family tradition, participating in rituals since childhood, and accepting the necessity of human sacrifice as a natural part of their existence. But when he fell in love with Sarah Mitchell, a schoolteacher from a neighboring county, his perspective began to change. Sarah's innocence and genuine goodness created a stark contrast to the darkness that permeated Timothy's world. For the first time in his life, he began to question whether the power and prosperity his family enjoyed was worth the price they paid. When the entities demanded that Sarah herself be offered as a sacrifice, her pure spirit would provide exceptional nourishment. Timothy finally rebelled against his family's ancient bargain. The confrontation that followed was violent and supernatural. Timothy attempted to break the family's connection to the mountain entities by destroying the stone circle where the original ritual had been performed, but the stones had absorbed decades of blood and suffering, and they had become conduits for forces beyond human comprehension. The destruction of the circle created a spiritual explosion that was felt throughout the region. An earthquake registering 4.2 on the Richter scale struck Devil's Fork Valley, though seismologists could find no geological explanation for the tremor. Every piece of glass within 5 miles of the Ashford property shattered simultaneously. Livestock throughout the area died instantly, found the next morning with their eyes rolled back and their mouths frozen open in silent screams. The Ashford family compound was found burned to the ground, though no one could explain how the fire had started or why it had burned so completely. Investigation revealed the basement ritual chamber, but the symbols carved into its walls had been obliterated as though scraped away by enormous claws. The bodies of 11 family members were discovered in the ruins, but Timothy and Sarah were never found. Henrik Volkov, now ancient and nearly mad, was discovered wandering the mountains 3 days after the disaster. He claimed that the entities had been banished, but not destroyed, sent back to whatever realm they had originally inhabited. But he warned that their influence might linger in the bloodline, manifesting in future generations who carried the Ashford genetic heritage. The official investigation concluded that the family had died in an accidental fire, possibly caused by faulty wiring in their basement workshop. The ritual chamber was explained as an elaborate wine cellar, and the strange symbols were attributed to the eccentric, artistic interests of the family patriarch. All evidence was quickly buried, and Devil's Fork Valley was quietly purchased by the federal government and designated as protected wilderness. But the story didn't end with the fire. Over the decades that followed, children with the distinctive Ashford features, pale skin, unusually bright green eyes, and 6 fingers on their left hand, began appearing in adoption agencies throughout the Southeast. These children invariably displayed troubling behavioral patterns, an inability to form genuine emotional attachments, a fascination with pain and suffering, and an uncanny ability to manipulate others through means that couldn't be easily explained. Social workers learned to recognize the signs and developed unofficial protocols for handling Ashford descendants. The children were placed with experienced families, provided with extensive psychological counseling, and monitored throughout their adolescence. Some overcame their dark heritage and lived normal lives. Others disappeared into the wilderness, drawn by instincts they couldn't understand toward mountains that called to them in dreams. Today, Devil's Fork Valley remains off limits to the public, officially due to unstable geological conditions and protected wildlife habitats. But local rangers report strange phenomena that persist decades after the Ashford family's destruction. Hikers who venture too close to the area experience disorientation and memory loss. Electronic equipment malfunctions in specific locations, and on certain nights, especially during the new moon, visitors claim to hear chanting in an unknown language echoing from deep within the mountains. The most disturbing reports come from the few researchers granted permission to study the area. They describe finding stone fragments scattered throughout the valley, pieces of the original ritual circle that somehow survived its destruction. These fragments emit low-level electromagnetic radiation and cause severe psychological distress in anyone who handles them for extended periods. Some fragments have been recovered and stored in government facilities, but they continue to exhibit anomalous properties. Researchers report that the symbols carved into these stones appear to change configuration when observed under different lighting conditions. Attempts to photograph or scan the symbols result in images that show only blank stone, as though the markings exist outside the spectrum of normal human perception. The legacy of the Ashford family serves as a reminder that in Appalachia's most isolated corners, where cellular signals fail and GPS systems spin helplessly, some bargains can never be truly broken. The entities they served may have been banished, but the hunger they represented, the human willingness to sacrifice anything for survival and prosperity, remains as strong as ever. Even now, local emergency services maintain unofficial protocols for dealing with incidents in Devil's Fork Valley. Missing persons reports are processed with unusual urgency. Search and rescue teams are instructed never to work alone in the area, And on nights when the wind carries sounds that might be voices speaking in tongues that predate human language, experienced mountain folk simply lock their doors and wait for dawn. Because in these ancient hills, where mist moves with purpose and shadows fall at impossible angles, the Ashford name is still whispered as a warning, a reminder that some prices are too high to pay, but once paid can never be refunded.